Today is November 12th, 2022. Welcome to Native Calgarian. Oki, Naganago, Mekoche Chestokom Aki, or Dekots Nagotine Siku. Hi, my name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she and her pronouns. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Great Bear Lake Tribe in Treaty 11. My name, Dekots Nagotine Siku, is Red Thunder Woman in Satu Dene. My people wore rabbit skins, so it's often been referred to as the land of the hair people. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene Nation is a visitor to this area of Clincho Tine Indahe in Satu Dene, meaning many big dog town, named after the Calgary Stampede. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot, Mokinstis, is Michelle Elliott, an English name which has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknives Dene. Through my father, I am a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution while having a Canadian Indian Act imposed status card, which is a colonial construct by Canadian policies meant to divide Indigenous peoples' inherent rights. Indigenous Two-Spirit, or the Indigenous 2S LGBTQ2+ community, and Indigenous women are at the bottom of the Canadian socioeconomic ladder because of colonial trauma, imposed poverty, racism, gendered violence, and land theft. I do not speak on behalf of all Indigenous, but I just share my journey as I walk down the red road. As a Dene woman who has attempted to run after joining harmful colonial parties, spent money to be at expensive conventions, left my home to travel to those conventions just to vote on incomplete policies that still allow of incarceration, a denial of justice, denial of health services, racism, colonial trauma, and genocide for Indigenous and Black peoples, I have work to continue to do, reports to advocate for, and attempt to work within these systems meant to harm me and my community. I think of all of this today, and I hope we honor the many Indigenous lives that are lost or incarcerated for the so-called country named Canada. I hope you all see your role in the importance of stopping harm, and as a citizen, see your role in reconciliation and as a treaty partner. Pride Month should never just be 1 month, as it is important to understand the straight agenda and gendered violence was and is forced on this land by Christian outsiders. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as a guest and acknowledging your role as a treaty partner in a so-called time of reconciliation. It's important that land acknowledgements have meaning. I encourage all folks to introduce themselves with an acknowledgement of their ancestors, stories of displacement, how you perceive your role as a treaty partner, a citizen of Canada, a refugee, or other land displacement, so we as Indigenous people know how safe you are to be around. If you don't know how to pronounce your local Indigenous nations' names, won't say your pronouns, won't say your story of origin, won't acknowledge stolen lands, won't acknowledge imposed economic oppression and your role in reconciliation, I determine how safe you are to be around my community, my family, and myself. Understanding land acknowledgements and their importance is Indigenous 101 because it immediately addresses colonialism, oppression dynamics, broken treaties, and lies taught today in Canadian schools nationally. That's why settlers and those who call themselves Native Calgarians, or whatever town you're from, show me you have no Indigenous 101 understanding. Jesse Winte's book Unreconciled explains it perfect, as do many Indigenous authored books. Land Back is a movement that would save the planet from climate change created by colonialism, but also would be a part of a treaty partnership, part of meaningful reconciliation and honoring global initiatives like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I honor the Blackfoot as the elders and members taught me how to be kind in my Red Road journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name in Blackfoot, and Leonard Kenny taught me how to pronounce my spirit name in Satu Dene. My humblest apologies to the Blackfoot and Dene elders and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. I'm speaking to you on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the imposed US-Canadian border are the Blackfeet, and north of the border are the Siksika, Gunai, and Bagani of the Confederacy. These lands are Treaty 7 signed September 22nd, 1877, with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Wesley, Chiniki, and Bearspaw nations of the Stoney, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit, status and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with the government signing on your behalf. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you to previous donors for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. To those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or questions. Also, giving a review helps, whatever medium you're listening from. I have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcast and pin posts on social media. So today I'm quite lucky to have Kyle with me. Kyle, would you like to introduce yourself in your way?
Ahau nioto tementik kiata meska tinawao ka yo Kyle nitasika soon sakahigan ayatsiniu otsinia. Hello everybody. Hello my friends. I greet you all. My name is Kyle. I come from the Lake of the Strangers area, also known as Slave Lake, Alberta, in Treaty 8 territory. I am currently a guest on Treaty 6 territory. I live in Edmonton, Alberta. And my family names are Laurendell and Shaw. I'm Métis, and I'm just happy to be with you. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, I'm really, really happy to have you here because first and foremost, you gave us a bit about your background, but why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do for a living?
Sure. So my mother is Métis. My dad is Polish and Ukrainian, which is where I get the funky last name from, Muzika. I grew up in Slave Lake. I lived there all the way until I was about 17, and I've lived in Edmonton pretty much since then, minus 2 months. I lived in Yellowknife when my first CBC job was in Yellowknife for a couple of months. I've worked at the CBC for about going on 7 years now, almost 8. I've worked in pretty much every role locally that I possibly could. And lately I've been working in radio. I work for CBC Radio nationally. I tend to focus on Indigenous storytelling specifically. So I try to help tell the stories of Indigenous people across the land. Whether it's, about children in care or, an artist's new album or, anything in between. I try to make sure that I try to help tell them in a good way and make sure that folks whose stories I'm helping to tell are in the driver's seat.
What really brought me to your attention right now was this conversation about incarceration. I love stories of telling our joy first and foremost. But at the same time, I know for somebody like myself who claims to be political and trying to do the right thing, I have to be educating myself regularly on the issues that are impacting us. And to me, we are literally prisoners in our own country. And it's happened over generations now. And this is just another example of the work that you're doing, spotlighting the incarceration issue that we're seeing. And I think a lot of non-Indigenous, they have so much anti-Indigenous bias that they think so poorly of us. Ironically, I think it was Nelson Mandela who said that you just look in the jails to see the politics of a country. And with us being overrepresented, it's so clear this is all about stolen land theft, and continuation of propaganda against our people. And so seeing that you have a 6-part series coming out on the incarceration of Indigenous people, I was super excited to ask you to come on the show and have you come on to talk about it because, it needs a more nuanced conversation. And unfortunately, that's not what Canadians here, obviously by design. That's propaganda, right? So I was wondering if you wanted to discuss a little bit about why you chose this particular subject and how it came to be. And you must have went to school in Edmonton for media in some capacity.
I did, yeah. I went to MacEwan University, which is quite similar, I think, to Calgary's Mount Royal in size and some programs as well. I decided to focus on this because, I think anytime I want to focus on something that's a little bit more of a deep dive, it's usually has impacted me in some way. I did a series previously on children in care, which was inspired by Noko, my grandmother, who was a foster parent to over 100 children kind of throughout her foster parent career, some for a weekend, some for 18 years. It just kind of depended on the situation. And so this one, I have a couple family members, a couple of cousins and second cousins who have been impacted by the justice system. And I think you take one look at it, and I think it's pretty easy to see that it's rife with issues. I mean, anytime you've got 5% of the population it represents is Indigenous of the entire country, and then 32% of the federally incarcerated folks identify as Indigenous. That's an incredible rate. I think that's something that I thought deserved a look and a closer look. To your point about it's always sort of been this way. I think what's really interesting is in the folks that I spoke to. I had a couple people tell me that Indigenous people, ever since colonization, ever since settlers came over, have been imprisoned on their own lands in various ways, and some of them overlap. I mean, you go from people putting people onto reserves to to residential schools, to all the way to incarceration. Of course, all of those overlap, but in a sense, it's felt like not just people who have committed crimes are imprisoned on their own lands, but really everybody. I heard from, I was working on a different story, and I heard from an elder that First Nations people weren't supposed to really live on reserves primarily. Reserves were meant to be retirement communities for elders, where they could maintain ceremony and where they could live on the land and be relatively untouched. And we're seeing like an incredible amount of poverty on reserves that is driving folks to places where they don't necessarily want to go, but they don't have any other choice. And so that's what happens oftentimes when people are committing crimes, is that they don't really know how else to survive. And then you run into this idea of how high the recidivism rates or the reoffending rates are. And I'm sure we'll get into that, but I think it's just an endless cycle for folks. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really challenging for people to break that cycle without proper supports. And so those are some of the things that I had been thinking about kind of prior to moving into wanting to look at this a little closer.
Right. So I was having a look, and thank you for pinning your post about this particular issue. So we have the very first part of your 6-part series here, and episode 1. So do you do podcasting, and how would folks get to listen to it? And then of course there is some articles here as well, but they don't go nearly as deep as audio does. So how would people access that?
Yeah, so our hilariously, CBC's radio page isn't the most friendly to navigate, so it's kind of challenging to find anything on that page. So it's been what I've been doing is I've just been posting these stories as they air across the country on different radio programs. I've just been posting them online, and I've just been posting them in a Twitter thread. I've had a few people reach out to me over email and ask me to send them as well, which is kind of what I've been doing, which it's not the greatest way to promote the work. But I usually, if folks are curious, I usually direct them to the Twitter thread, because it gives me the ability to share a little bit of context. And it's also chronological, because even the feed that these stories live in is not totally chronological, which is just bad UI, but I'm just kind of trying to deal with it as I can. So I would direct people to that if somebody were to ask.
Yeah, that's great. I know how hard this is, because I've been running a book club since 2016. And, you try to show people that bigger picture of what TRC is like. So we've gone through all the volumes of TRC. We did the PASS system. We did Lost Harvests, Clearing the Plains, to try to give that context. Right now, we're really focused on the missing and murdered Indigenous women inquiry. And I think between that and the child welfare component, it's so clear that we've always been incarcerated in some capacity. But, it is shocking to me that folks that have been reading this along for years with me still, they don't comprehend the gravity of it, right? I don't know sometimes what it's going to take to really get through all of that, but you did talk to the personal part of it as well. And I know this fantastic artist in this city right now, and he feels that there's not enough said about that being incarcerated and being in solitary confinement. And out of his four buddies, all of them went to jail, but only two are living right now. And I find, and I'm sure you do as well, that colonial trauma comes in so many different ways and so many different aspects. So many of our folks also struggle with addiction as a result of all of this trauma, trying to deal with mental health services that are not culturally appropriate. And, so that was a big conversation I wanted to have with you. But let's start, I guess, first with the first episode here, how it talked about 32% of federal inmates are Indigenous, and how did we get here? Now, I just for full transparency, I'm a card-carrying liberal, so much so actually of the Indigenous Peoples Commission like tattooed on me, and that's a part of the Liberal Party of Canada. So from my point of view, when Harper instituted these mandatory sentences, et cetera, to me, that was like the catalyst of a lot of it. But now we have been in power since 2015. And we've seen how our justice minister, the first Indigenous woman justice minister, was treated, eventually kicked out of the party. I get to see her on Sunday. I'm super excited. So we're seeing that. And we're seeing how these rates are not changing despite not having Harper in place. But that said, I mean, this is consecutive conservative liberals since the beginning of Canada that has created this mess. So I was just wondering if you wanted to maybe just start with the very first part here and talk about this piece of over incarceration and how it affects us as Indigenous people.
I think a stat that is particularly incredible to me, and one that really sticks out, is that 50% of female identifying inmates, federal inmates, are Indigenous. So that's half, which is absolutely mind-blowing to me. I think when we think about, you had mentioned the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry. When we think about treaty and we think about how many of our communities were matriarchal, sorry, the women ran the show, and of course the men obviously helped, but the women were the leaders in a lot of our communities. And when we think about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, that's Exhibit A of how we are not taking care of our women in our community. And, Exhibit B or Exhibit A, number 2 is that, half of the federal population of women who are incarcerated are Indigenous. Like, we're clearly not doing a good enough job taking care of our women. And I think that is a huge part of it. I think, the fact that we're seeing recidivism rates or reoffending rates for Indigenous people, Indigenous men on the prairie specifically, are at about 70%, which means that 70% of people Indigenous men who get released reoffend. We see nationwide, we see about a 60% reoffending rate within 5 years. So 60% of Indigenous people who are offending reoffend within 5 years. That tells us that we are not doing a good enough job taking care of these people when they are out. I heard stories and stories and stories of people who said, I got out of prison and I had $80 in my pocket. What am I supposed to do with $80? And so of course they're going to turn to the only way that they've known to make money, which is crime. Because as we all know, it's increasingly difficult to get work as somebody who's a convicted felon. There's a whole whack of things that Indigenous people are impacted disproportionately at. They're more likely to be put into solitary confinement. Hilariously, they call it structured intervention units now, but still solitary confinement as far as I'm concerned. And, we see that Indigenous people are, they have violence used by correctional officers at disproportionate rates. They're more likely to be labeled as a gang member. They're more likely to self-harm. It's everything. I think that every stat that we sort of can track, Indigenous people are impacted disproportionately within those prison walls. And so, another thing that you said that was really interesting is, in your conversations, you found that sometimes people have a hard time linking the two, or linking things between like incarceration or, the child welfare. Everything is related. Everything is connected. When we think about, when I asked inmates and I asked correctional investigators about what is colloquially known as the pipeline from the child welfare system to the prison system, but like everybody said, it almost felt sort of normalized that this was a fact. The people that I spoke to they were in foster care. They said like a large majority of people were 60 scooped, or they were in foster care, or both. And so when we think about, it's not linear, like these things are not linear, but they're all connected. Everything's connected. When you take away land, when you take away culture, of course, people are going to be impacted in a negative way. And so, ultimately, one of the things that I think that I really hope this series gets across is that all of these things are connected, and we can't just, one of the pieces that I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit is concerns Gladue reports, which is a deterrent that is meant to impact, or is meant to help Indigenous offenders sort of seek alternative dressing for their wrongs. So like restorative justice programs, for example. We can't fix these problems with just one bolt-on solution like that, because clearly things are getting worse. And I think when we think about how these numbers have constantly risen, regardless of who's in power, it's clear that neither or any of the governments that have ever been in power while these problems are going on have had the tools or the solutions or the willpower or the gall to fix them.
Yep. No, I'm with you, and I'm proud to be a liberal, but yet I'm not proud that we cannot seem to get moving on this. And then, of course, I was going to talk to you about the Gladue reports next, because that's the second part of your series. And I'm also the MMIW co-chair for Calgary, and a lot of our MMIWs we see come straight out of foster care and the those homes that they have. And of course, then they're kicked out on the streets with absolutely nothing. And so of course they end up dead, and people are somehow shocked by this. And it's horrific to me that anyone who lives in this country who thinks they're so-called helping natives could live with these facts, but I know they don't know, and they purposely don't know, and nobody's teaching them on purpose, all these things. So through the Gladue reports, I've found out there's like only two people in the city that really write Gladue reports from a trauma-informed Indigenous point of view. The other ones are very colonial in their thinking and write it from a colonial standpoint. So like when you said, and I read somewhere something about the Gladue reports not working, I'm like, no, they're not working. And I know I've tried to talk about this with other people, but Kyle, I'm not going to lie, as an Indigenous woman, like it is shocking to me how I can say the sky is blue. You can say the sky is blue. But if Justin Trudeau says the sky is blue, then the sky is blue, right? Like it is shocking to me, the dismissal, the anti-Indigenous bias, the, misogyny. So like I can say these things, but people don't hear it. And especially with the Gladue reports, like there's a backlog. It's expensive. And there's only like two people that really write it from a somewhat better point of view, as opposed to a completely Tom Flanagan way, right? So those are things that I know in my life, but I'd love to hear what you uncovered and what you learned.
Well, I think the thing that I was most shocked by, and I learned a lot throughout this process, But the one single fact, if I had to pick one that I was most shocked by, was about Gladue reports. I had an opportunity to speak to the former correctional investigator of Canada, Howard Sapers, who's fantastic, and really gave me a lot of insight as to how things work. He was a correctional investigator, I think, for over a decade. And he was very, very frustrated with how the lack of action. I mean, they had every year had talked about, we need to do something about the mass incarceration of Indigenous people in this country, and even offered solutions, but it had never really changed anything. It was one of the things he said was one of his biggest regrets, is that he wasn't able to make more progress on that. But the thing that he told me about Gladue reports that was really, really interesting is that, first of all, you're right, Michelle, they're severely understaffed. The amount of Gladue writers versus the amount of Gladue reports that in theory should be written as per the Supreme Court of Canada ruling in 1999 is severely lacking. I mean, when we talk about the criminal code and how there's a specific section in there that talks about, we need to consider an Indigenous offender. Every Indigenous offender needs to have a consideration for restorative justice programs to help break, a cycle. Of course, I'm butchering that language. They wrote it much nicer than I did. But with Gladue reports in specific, these are meant to be, the Supreme Court says that every Indigenous person who wants one should get one. And so we're seeing across the country that this is not the case. We're seeing, of course, there's hardly any stats to go by because people don't keep them, but we've heard anecdotally, especially from former and the current correctional investigators, that there are people who aren't getting Gladue reports. But the ones who are, and this is what really shocked me, was that these can actually have a negative impact on folks who are offenders. So what happens is, you are an Indigenous offender and you get a Gladue report written. This is completely made up. I'm making all this up, but for the sake of example, this offender, let's say, had a history, an early history of substance abuse. Maybe they started using alcohol and drugs at, age 9 or 10. Maybe age 11 or 12, they had like a violent outburst or, a string of violent events. And so these are often written into the Gladue report to illustrate to the judge that this person had a hard life. And because of colonialism, because of structural racism, this person was not allowed to engage in their culture. They grew up in poverty. So these are the things that happened. What can happen in turn, though, is the judge might see this and say, oh, this person has violent tendencies, or this person is very susceptible to substance abuse. I'm going to mark this person a dangerous offender. And so a dangerous offender designation is really, really challenging for folks. Indigenous people are disproportionately named dangerous offenders as well. And what this can mean is that, especially for more serious crimes where you are offered parole, dangerous offenders do not ever really get parole. It is very, very, very rare, which means they don't get out before their time served. So if they're given life 7, for example, 7 years, you get your first opportunity at parole. They do technically they do have the opportunity to get parole, but with dangerous offenders, I think it's very, very few and far between that they actually get released early. So that means that they are in jail for longer. This can also mean if and when they do get out, it is even more challenging to get work, to have really any sort of semblance of a normal life. And so that the Gladue reports were meant to help steer Indigenous folks to restorative justice programs and to help them break any cycles they might be in. That they had the opposite effect was really, really shocking to me, and not something that I had considered, but something, when it was explained to me, made a lot of sense.
Sure. Oh, that it is horrifying, because that was exactly the point of having them, was to showcase that it's a lack of cultural supports, a lack of cultural understanding, colonial trauma in many different levels, educational, racism, all these things, right? So it's just heartbreaking to hear that. And I'm glad that you brought it up. As I said, I have a friend who was incarcerated and had, way too many times spent alone. And I know that breaks a lot of our UN charters. And I see that that's a kind of concern of the 3rd episode. Did you want to elaborate a little more about what you uncovered there?
Yeah, I mean, this story was not, I did not break the story. This was a well-known story, especially within like circles around criminal justice reform. But when I heard the story of Eddie Snowshoe, who was a Gwich'in man, who died by suicide in federal custody, hearing his story was very, it highlighted and illuminated so many problems that we see within the justice system. I mean, this man was, again, had run out of options in terms of trying to provide for his family, and in turn decided to try to attempt to rob a cab driver. He shot at the cab driver. Nobody died or anything, but he was sentenced to a few years in prison, I believe, and was sent to Stony Mountain Institution, which is a infamous institution in Manitoba. And so, one that actually, many of our, Nahio leaders were in, including Chief Big Bear, after he was sentenced for treason, shortly after the Treaty 6 was signed. And so he was in prison and was very clearly communicating to people, at least, from what we understand, that he had intended to self-harm. And so that suggests to us that he had untreated mental health issues and stuff that needed to be addressed, but wasn't. He had made what correctional officers called a knife out of a juice box. So I'm assuming it was just a folded juice box with sort of like a sharp edge. And so for that, he was put in solitary confinement. The UN Charter, one of the UN charters says that if you spend any person who spends longer than, I think, 15 days in solitary confinement, that is considered torture. He was in solitary confinement for 162 straight days before he took his own life. And so I had the opportunity to speak with Chris Statnick, who's a Vuntut Gwich'in lawyer. Fantastic person. And I really was so grateful for him for sharing this story, because clearly it still impacts him, and it really impacted me in a very significant way, because it's just so tragic. Something
Yes.
that could have been largely prevented if we actually, cared about restorative justice, and if we cared about helping people become better people, maybe he would still be alive. If we had given more control to communities who, shifted responsibilities to communities who wanted to help their own people, maybe he would still be alive. Who knows? I think it was just really emblematic of a lot of things that we saw as wrong with the justice system. And it really impacted me in a very significant way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know here in Calgary, we have a new justice circle, and we have a Croshoe who's a judge, but it's still really colonial. It's still lawyer speak, but in a circle. And so I'm not convinced like this is at all what we're looking for. Like, it's still colonial, and it's not back to we did not have jails before colonialism. We dealt with our family members. We helped them, we taught them, we see it as education. And that's not the case with colonialism in Canada. They're all like about punitive justice and incarceration. And Corrections Canada is improperly labeled because there's nothing about corrections to it. And I know they've done a huge campaign to try to pretend like they do rehabilitation, but it's not. And at the end of the day, we have imposed poverty by the Canadian government on Indigenous people, and that doesn't change in the time somebody's incarcerated. And racism and trying to get employment doesn't change while people are incarcerated. And I think that there's a huge need to understand that restorative justice is our communities looking after ourselves, not, some outsider from Britain with British laws telling our people how to behave and speak English and do English things. And, that's the opposite of reconciliation. It's the opposite of being treaty partners. It's the opposite of equality in treaty. Like, it's just, there's so many things wrong with everything that I see, but I just feel like nobody says these things out loud, and I don't understand why. And then, of course, like, I remember Murder in the First with Kevin Bacon, and it was a way to try to highlight that, oh no, jails are different, they've changed, but they're not different. And especially if you're Indigenous, you're still stuck in the stupid system of being left alone. And then, of course, that creates trauma. Like, people are not meant to be left alone, and especially our people, we are community based, right? So we're used to dealing not just with like our immediate family, the way the structure of Britain brought in, but that bigger picture of being with our aunties, our uncles, our grandmas, like that bigger picture. We're used to being in a community regularly. So and then to take an Indigenous person and put them into a little box and never let them see or talk, it's no wonder our people are committing suicide. And I'm heartbroken. I think of right here where I live. I've been with the Crazy Bull family. They lost Jackie during Stampede in 2007. And just recently, Sonny Crazy Bull died in police custody. And the ACERT could totally said it was fine. For folks who don't know, ACERT is supposed to be an oversight body of people that die in police custody and or are shot. Like, whenever there's a gun by a cop, ACERT's supposed to investigate, but ultimately it's ex-cops investigating cops. And so never is there anything done. And of course, they don't have any Indigenous training whatsoever. So, they just don't get it and continue to let these folks get away. So ACERT gave the clear. And for me, it's so, like, and for folks who are traumatized easily, I apologize, but when we are incarcerated, the first thing they do is like severe cavity searches, which in my world is rape, but because it's done by a so-called officer, it seems to be okay. So anyway, when that happens to us, and then they magically get a pill in the jail to do an overdose from, like, why isn't it the responsibility of the people who have them in the jails? It's not. And yet, Canada just is really okay with genocide of Indigenous people. And to me, that's what is the most upsetting, is that here we have a man who is just trying to do good for his family, trying to provide in a system that has every conceivable barrier at every single point for us to be able to thrive. And, now he's dead. And now this family is left without their dad, without their husband, without this brother, without their community member. And so I appreciate you sharing that. I think that I hope we all learn more about Eddie Crochue and make changes directly. In part 4, you talk about the 60 scoop, and you talk about how the system is like, get caught, go to jail, get out, rinse and repeat. So I guess we're kind of talking a bit about that. Hey, is there anything more that you'd like to add about that?
Just that I was able to speak with somebody who is currently incarcerated, and I call him Stephen in the piece. That's not his actual name. We wanted to just conceal his identity, just in case that might negatively impact him within the prison walls. But he was really generous and was sharing his experiences. I mean, he had a really hard life. He was part of the 60 Scoop, who was in foster care. And just like the way he explained his life, and he had a quote in there where he said, I got out and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I got out and I did the only thing that I knew to make money, which was commit crimes. And so, we get to a point where I just thought it was a really nice example, not nice, I guess, but like, it's unfortunate, but it's a poignant example of something that is ever present with a lot of folks who experience incarceration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's, to me, that bigger picture of folks in trauma, constant trauma, constant survival mode. And we don't talk about that enough as as a society, what that does to you regularly, coming from a system that denies you a chance to ever heal. That's for sure. And then episodes 5 and 6 are not quite up yet. What can we look forward to?
Well, episode 5 deals with, I was able to speak with somebody who is a prison advocate, Sherry Meyer, who is another fantastic person who's doing a lot of work for people, I think, who, I think people kind of, I don't know what it's like in Calgary, but in Edmonton, Edmonton Max is a prison that is like renowned across the country as being a bad place. And it's just outside the city limits. You drive by it if you're heading east. And I think, a lot of people, when they drive by it, they're like, oh, there's the prison. And then they just drive by. I think it's very easy to compartmentalize prison. Yep. As something that just is a thing about society that you never have to deal with. One of the things I was thinking about when you asked me what was something that sort of inspired you to do the work, mm-hmm. I had a conversation with some friends of mine who are from here or from elsewhere, who are white people, and it was really interesting how when they were talking, because one of them had dealt with a friend of theirs who had recently went to jail, and they were talking about how they had never experienced something like that. And they were like, wow, has anybody else ever experienced that? And, you look around the whole table and everybody's like shaking their head no. And I thought it was really interesting because, not that I thought it was a normal experience, but it was really interesting that people had an experience what I experienced with like having friends and family members who had gone to jail. And, like sometimes I see releases, like news releases in our media inbox, and I know the people who were arrested. Like it's just the things that I, experienced growing up in a small town. I don't think that's certainly unique, but it was one of those things that really inspired the work. I had the opportunity in that 5th episode to also talk to somebody who was incarcerated and has since got out and has built a life for himself. Which, you talk about doing stories about an Indigenous joy. I certainly wouldn't classify it as joy, but I think it's a good opportunity to talk to somebody who is a success story, sort of that rose through the concrete, that despite all of the barriers and despite likely having little to no support when you get out, somebody who, is now a support worker for, Indigenous folks who are experiencing homelessness in Montreal, like that. Those are the types of things that I think, are victories. Of course, it does not absolve him from the crime he committed. But at the end of the day, I mean, what are we doing if we are not allowing space for people to redeem themselves and to heal? And so in the final episode, we talk about solutions. So, I'm not one who proposes solutions, but I talk to some folks who do. And, there's the solutions range everywhere from, more significant restorative justice programs all the way to prison abolition. So what does that look like in practice? What would it look like if we didn't have prisons and we instead made people who, committed crimes, put them with the responsibility of their communities? And what would that look like? How would we support that? Some of these things are really big picture, blue sky, everything breaks right kind of ideas. But I mean, again, what are we doing if we're not trying to, make our society a better place to live? And so, while not forgetting that these people are people who deserve empathy and they deserve care, doesn't absolve them from the stuff that they've done. But I think at the same time, I think we have to have space for redemption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm with you. And I think, the TRC and the inquiry, and the UNDRIP, they give us guidelines. Like, why can't we at least start trying to emulate them in some capacity? Like, why has that been so difficult? And then, of course, you have provincial and federal jurisdiction, and you don't see cooperation. Like, as a liberal in Calgary, I can tell you We are not seeing it at the municipal level, the provincial level, right? That working together partnership. Like you get the odd counselor that might, but unfortunately, that's few and far between. And we're not talking about systemic changes, right? We have the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate, and every year they put out the stats of how many kids are dying in custody, how many are dying in incarceration, really, because they're incarceration facilities. And solutions, and they never get implemented. So to me, we have guidelines. We just don't have politicians that are brave enough to institute them. And we have this new government that wants to create some sort of police force that we've shown has absolutely no value whatsoever. In fact, worse, it's going to take billions of dollars that we don't have and create a workforce that's insanity. And I don't mean to be ableist. Actually, I'm trying not to use ableist terms, but to me, that there's no logical sense to this. So there's no, like, I can't wrap my head around it in any capacity of why we would want to invest in a police force that we know is not going to help us in any capacity. But yet, if we were to be honest about who's in the jails and who needs those services, I can't light a smudge in most places. And this is like a huge part of our practice, let alone trying to learn our language, let alone trying to, integrate back into our own communities, and then having economic opportunities when we're there to be able to provide for our families in some capacity. Like it's just it's gross, and we don't have proper healthcare, or folks with disabilities don't have the proper supports they need. So and I just go back to Ralph Klein cutting all of the mental health supports back then. And I could not understand how people wouldn't see this as the outcome of all of this work, and jurisdictional limits. And do you talk at all about that in this conversation, or do you focus mainly on feds? Or
Yeah, it's mostly on the feds, because those are the stats that sort of guided the work. But I think, speaking about police in specific, I mean, I'm sure you're finding it in Calgary, certainly here in Edmonton. We have a lot of police who are, and peace officers who issue tickets for loitering, or essentially hanging out in LRT stations, for example, or in public places that they don't want them in. A large majority of folks who experience homelessness within our city are Indigenous. There are relatives.
Yep.
And so what happens when you have unpaid tickets? People, they can send you to remand. And now this is not typically federal remand, but it's provincial. But these are how these cycles continue to perpetuate, right? When we talk about, an Alberta police force, obviously I can't really have an opinion on whether it'll work or not. But one thing that I do know is that the current police system and how it operates disproportionately impacts Native people on this land.
Yep.
When we when the Nehewak and the Soto and the Stoney signed Treaty 6, and to your communities in the Blackfoot Confederacy signed Treaty 7, one of the stipulations was around free and unabsolved movement within the treaty territory for all First Nations folks.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about these types of incarceration, whether it's through foster care or whether it's through the, over ticketing homeless people to over incarcerating them in our jails, that is not being a good treaty person. And so when we talk about an Alberta police force, the issues with the RCMP aren't just specific to the RCMP. Police work on the whole have a whole lot of work to do to decolonize and to stop disproportionately arresting and impacting our relatives. And so, at the end of the day, these things are really, really important to the whole conversation about over incarceration, because I think if we don't fix that issue, these folks are going to continue to be put into the jails at disproportionate rates and get impacted. Because, I don't think this is a newsflash to anybody, but jail is not a safe place. And it's certainly not a place for folks to better themselves, it's really, really hard to do that in that environment without proper support. So, I think it's really good that you brought that up. Most of the work that I did this time is around the feds, but I think it's all intrinsically linked for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's heartbreaking. And I obviously feel very passionate that if we're going to be talking as a country built on human rights, like that we absolutely are built on stolen land and genocide. So like that narrative of us being good people internationally, it's always shocking to me because yeah, as an indigenous person, you grow up in this country, you know better, but the narrative is out there, and it's just it it's upsetting. It's hard. Just to give you some context, we're going to have a Standoff by Bruce McIver in December. On Monday is our National Inquiry, Chapter 7 and 8. So like we're always talking about the injustice for sure. But that's this really small group of people that come to a book club, and as like I think audio podcasts, it's so much better, radio, so much better, especially for storytellers to tell their stories. To me, it's such important work that you're doing right now. I wish you so well on it. And you made a mention to doing it for child welfare. And I think that's another important conversation to me. It's like, the mini incarceration and then the maximum. And then ironically, childhood trauma is probably the worst trauma that you live for life with, right? Like you can't just undo it like that. And I wanted to ask you real quick if COVID was brought up as an excuse for solitary confinement, because I know I read that once and I just thought, you truckers, like
Yeah.
any excuse
Yeah.
to mistreat our people, right?
Yeah, it did come up in speaking with the correctional investigators, both former and current. They spoke about the need for structured intervention units or solitary confinement, but only in respect to keeping people safe. I don't believe that they are, like, they're certainly not advocates for it, but I think they see a need. But it did come up for sure. COVID also came up in the context of it being increasingly difficult to access ceremony. So as you might be able to understand, and I think a lot of Native people, certainly reconnecting folks like myself, it's really, really hard to engage with culture. If you don't know anybody, it's really, really challenging to do that within the prison walls. And so what they're finding is, with COVID, elders were less frequent. Of course, I think things are getting a little bit better now, but certainly at the height, it was really challenging for folks to engage with their culture. Many of these people are engaging with it for the first time, right? Because it was stolen away from them as children. And so, I think when we're talking about restorative justice, if you can't really do any of that restorative work, how could there be justice?
100%. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Kyle, about maybe some upcoming projects too? And we'll put a link of this work, obviously, when we release this episode tomorrow. And if there's anything else you'd like to add, please don't hesitate.
Sure. So we've got 2 more editions coming out on Monday and Tuesday. And then what I might do as well is I'll send you, I did do a series on child welfare and children in care, so I can send that thread to you as well. And yeah, I'm working on a project about Treaty 6 right now, which is really exciting. We're hoping to air it in the new year.
Oh, that's great. To me, this is the most important work of reconciliation, is us trying to reclaim who we are. So thank you so much for coming onto the show. Thank you for explaining everything that you're doing. I have this ridiculous exit with resources. You're more than welcome to chime in if you'd like to, but thank you for coming on. And this will probably go to air tomorrow.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kananas Comington. Thank you for having me, Michelle. I was really grateful to do it.
Yeah, I'd love to have you on anytime. And because obviously to me, this is the solidarity work we have to do together, nationally, provincially, and just locally, anything that we can do to promote the good parts, but also to show a spotlight. Like, and to me, I'm a proud liberal, but I'm not proud. of this. These are things that need to end immediately. Child apprehension, children being incarcerated, adults being incarcerated. Like, this has to end immediately. I can't understand how anyone thinks we are a land of opportunity when, like, my own brother can't get a job because he's like, maybe the lighting is really bad, but he's even darker than I am, and I have my dad's light eyes and he has my mom's dark eyes, right? So he looks far more native than I do, and I'm afraid for him leaving the house. I know the way the police are here. You know what, right behind my old work was where Robin Fiddler was murdered by the police. It's really hard for me to feel safe here, and I have a 15-year-old daughter. I don't want the next generation and the generations after to go through any of this anymore. It's unacceptable. It's 2022, and and unfortunately, a friend of mine who's visibly Cree, he just he just went to a mall, and his son was denied a haircut because an accusation of lice when the child did not, and they went to another place and it was fine. Like, the racism is so pervasive. Our own city councilors are busy making racial and misogynistic jokes drunk, and that getting aired, and it's just a gross time. And I really hope that we can move forward in a good way. And I think that, your last episode, having solutions, is good. I know Jody Wilson Rainbow has put out, she's on her third book. So, I always laugh when people ask me what the solutions are. I'm like, have you never picked up a report? Have you never picked up a book? Have you never listened to a podcast or anything? Because we always give the solutions.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I'm really, like, I'm team RCAP, like the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples.
Yes.
Like, that document is ever expansive and has incredible amounts of solutions that are still applicable today. Even Yep. I think it's 25 years old now.
1996. And that's what I tell people, like, that's been out since then. So don't tell me we haven't brought solutions to the table. We just haven't had them implemented by anybody with any political courage. And, so ironically, like, in a lot of ways, I've seen so much change since 2015. But when it comes to this issue, I have not, and it needs to change immediately. So know that I find your work some of the most important work that you're doing, that should be out there, that it should be on every Canadian's mind. And I know while half of our listeners are here in Alberta, the other half are in Ontario. So it was really important that you mentioned that this was more federally based, so that they know that this affects them too. Even though you and I are in Alberta talking about Alberta, this is a national problem, a national issue with national solutions, frankly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm really grateful to make space for it. I think none of this stuff, I think, is new to you or I, but certainly some of it was. I certainly learned some stuff, but I think the problem in general is not new to us. But, I think we just have to keep talking about it until we catch somebody who's important, who can make these decisions to help change their tune a little bit.
Oh, let's hope. Let's hope. Well, thank you again. I'm proud of this podcast giving solutions and cultural safety training and cultural first aid and all of them for creating safer space for Indigenous people of color, those with disabilities, and LGBTQ2+ to speak. I want to say thank you to authors Cheryl Ward, Chelsea Branch, and Alicia Fridkin of heretohelp.bc.ca. They have a great piece on what is Indigenous cultural safety and why I should care about it. Their work and those cultural action tools are available for everyone. So support work like that as part of your reconciliation work and settler understanding. We also have the Reconciliation Action Group here in Calgary. I just found out about the Deaf Chiefs. The Diefenbaker sports team calls themselves the Chiefs and have an inappropriate headdress. So, I know my listeners know this, and you're not doing nothing about it. So join the Reconciliation Action Group, because we need that changed and a million other things changed in the city. And if you're not from Calgary, there are committees everywhere, nationally, in churches. And if not, make one, start a book club. There's so much work to do. Internal racism or lateral violence is another form of violence that Indigenous and marginalized people experience by the structure of racism. You can go to racialequitytools.org. Donna Bevins put together a great piece on internalized racism, and that's something that I have to work every single day at unpacking. Do's and don'ts for bystander intervention. So when you see a Muslim being treated rudely on the C train, how many freaking times in a ribbon skirt? Have I been accosted and nobody has done anything? Do something, act. And these are your tools in order to do that work. Indigenous have been talking about our issues, sharing traumas and reports, commissions, and public hearings so that it can be regularly disregarded. No more. Honor our words, honor the treaties. Listen to politicians and their policies and their platforms. If they don't recognize the marginalized in their budget with Gender Equity Plus, if they don't, if they're making cuts to Indigenous education, uterus health choices, gay straight alliances, have a lack of human rights for migrants, immigrants, folks with disabilities, know that your vote to that party or that politician is directly negatively impacting marginalized people. Demand that they implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to actions, the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Kyle and I had mentioned RCAP, the multiple reports about child welfare reform, violence prevention, and now 231 calls to justice from the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit. Provincially in Alberta, the Kenney government created 113 pathways to justice. So all you blue voters should hold your blue MLAs to account on it. Follow the new Premier's Council on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and see if the new Premier will honor that. Municipally, we have the White Goose Flying Report. Denying these reports is a form of abuse called gaslighting. Our people are experiencing extreme racism in the educational, justice, and health institutions with multiple reports that say the same thing. Demand change from election platforms and politicians. If they don't understand colonialism, racism, privilege, and sexism, they literally have zero business running. It should be understood by all parties, local politicians, community organizations, community associations, and sports clubs, so that the Deaf Chiefs is not somehow acceptable. Google articles on how non-Indigenous Canadians can become allies. If you're experiencing emotional distress after anything we talked about today and want to talk, you can call the First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness helpline at 1-855-242-3310. It is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you can also go onto their website, hopeforwellness.ca, and they have a little text box in there. If more related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, you can call 844-413-6649. It is also 24/7. And if you're non-Indigenous, you can call Distress Center lines. There's usually a functioning 211 or 833-456-4566. 60 Scoop. You also have an Indigenous Society of Alberta at ssisa.ca. And the following are two LGBTQ plus crisis supports that are available in most places in Canada. So you can go to lifevoice.ca. Thank you to the Trevor Project for creating these. Trans Lifeline is 877-330-6366. And for youth, 844-7386. 866-844-7386. You know, I just came across some of the stats of how many folks are dying in the drug crisis right now, and how overburdened our ambulance and hospital systems are with COVID as well. So if you know somebody using substances, do not use alone. If you are using alone, you can contact the National Overdose Response Service at 888-688-NORS for support. And you can download the Brave or the DORS app. And I can't stress enough, if you are Indigenous in Alberta, you can start a relationship with your pharmacist, and you can actually access a Narcan a day. All Albertans are able to access a Narcan or a naloxone kit for free. And I beg of you that you have one on you at all times. And especially if you're in areas like public transportation, or in places that you know that there's a high homeless amount of people. That said, overdose happens everywhere, in every part of this city, the rich part as well as the poor part. So that's why those resources are so important to use, because we don't want to lose another person. Violence is my everyday reality. Every Indigenous generation has faced it. This is self-care, how I take my power back. It's why I started this podcast, to speak freely without interruption, without tone police, leadership shaming, gaslighting questions, as many people don't want to hear our opinions and our truths, but sure want to tell us what they think us Indigenous people should do, even though they may not know anything about us, don't understand colonialism, the constant surveillance that we are under, our protests, our vigils, and our rights. I and many others share a lot of information on racism and microaggressions, so it's just unacceptable to say them anymore. Learn about being trauma informed. Folks like me are dealing with internalized racism and gatekeeping, and folks who survive off the status quo, folks who are in their trauma, racial battle fatigue. So I just ask that you understand internal and external racism is an everyday reality for me, Indigenous peoples, folks with disabilities, QT BIPOC, and others. I want to say Masi Cho to my ancestors, to my granny, my mom, what strength looks like through your example. I want to thank my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt, my stepmom for showing me what a proud culture is through her Austrian family and roots, and teaching me to be a proud Calgarian. It is through her I'm a second generation Calgarian. I want to thank my numerous aunts and uncles for always loving me, supporting me, and guiding me and teaching me, despite me being a real shit ass when I was little. Thank you to my husband, Darcy, Big Buffalo Rock Man, for producing, editing the show. He's been my husband, childhood friend, father of my child, support down my journey of the Red Road, and has witnessed decades of sexism and racism to our child. Thunderpipe Necklace Woman, we are blessed to learn from you daily, and we are honored you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a better and stronger person. I hope my daughter and my family will be proud in the future of us trying to discuss these present day issues in a way that they can understand. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, Masi Cho. To those who cannot afford to give, I'd just love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or questions. I have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts, pin posts on social media. And if you want me to come and speak, I'll be happy to do so. I'm really excited to go talk to the Medicine Hat Police this week, and go from there. So I'd like to end by giving the side eye to those Calgary rabbits. You're lucky I'm not tradish. And my beautiful cousin responded, or you'd be in my dish. Thank you so much, folks, for listening.